It's car con carne. Let's eat in the car. It's car con carne. And now here's the star of our show, James Van Alstyne.
And welcome to Car Con Carne. Welcome to the holiday weekend. The show, this right here, is sponsored by our friends at Siren Records McHenry over there on Main Street in McHenry. Go pay them a visit. It's a holiday weekend. Treat yourself to some recorded music, a record perhaps, a cassette. They even have some 8-tracks. I swear to God, I've seen 8-tracks there. My guest today, she is an author. She is a writer. She is a music critic. She is author Jessica Hopper, whose revised and expanded version of this book is... It's not out yet, is it? Am I premature?
Tuesday,
okay.
It comes out on Tuesday.
I was enthusiastic. The first collection of criticism by a living female rock critic. She also wrote the book Night Moves. You read her stuff in the Chicago Reader, in the Chicago Tribune, Pitchfork, GQ, Rolling Stone, New York Times, Village Voice. Oh, my God. Jessica, hi.
Hi, thanks for having me, James.
So Tuesday, we will see you talking about this book on its release at the Chicago Humanities Festival. That's at 7 p.m.
Yes, I'm going to be in conversation with the greatest and powers.
Fantastic.
And so, yeah, I'm very excited for that.
So let's just start with the revised and expanded concept. Here we are 6 years later. Why revise? You got rid of some stuff. You added some stuff. What drove you to do this?
Well, when we were putting the book together in 2014 initially, you know, I don't want to say I had some other things to prove, but I was, I guess, just in a different, as a different person in a different headspace about my career. And I didn't put very much recent work in there. And I've had a significant body of work since then that I think really justified being in the book, justified having a revision of the book. And also, I just think differently as a critic. And I really wanted to have something that was a more expansive arc. I was just very grateful because when I am doing another book with for our Stress Drew with MCD, the imprint that's putting out this book. And I sold them a different book that I'm doing. And when we were wrapping up negotiations on that, they said, well, would you also like to bring your criticism collection here and just do a revised and expanded? And then once we really started thinking about what could be in there and how to make it basically a different book, I had to go again back to my archives and, it's rereading everything. Not everything you've ever written, but, sort of starting anew with a different mindset about this book really gave me a chance to basically make a different book. And for that, I'm really grateful. And that's not to say anything, about the first edition of the first collection. It's just that it is a different book. And, some of the more landmark pieces of my career, like my interview with Pitchfork or the Rolling Stone Women piece. I mean, there's like a handful of things that we just didn't get to do, by virtue of they came out since the first book was published. And so I just got to come to it with a really different approach, and I'm grateful.
Let's start with, as far as the new editions go, let's start with The Silver Lining Myth, which you wrote in November of 2016.
I wrote it the day after, the morning after the election. Yeah.
Because I'm reading this, and this was my first time reading this piece. I thought, oh my God, I'm one of those people who thought that music would somehow take a turn magically with a new administration. And one of my favorite lines in the book is from this piece. But it's clear that as a country, we are entering a time when music can only provide so much cover. We're going to need to work closely together, and we're going to need to get real. You were right. I don't think that happened, but you were absolutely right.
That's kind of a funny thing about being able to go back to old work, you get even with a long view, you get a better sense of either how wrong you were or how prescient you were.
Mm-hmm.
And there's sometimes things that I like email where the girls aren't. I wish it wasn't as salient as it is now. I mean, maybe even more so with time. There's certain pieces that have, at the time, is arguing for a different future. And sometimes those futures have come to pass. And I'm very grateful to be around long enough to see how scenes that I either was involved with or was chronicling have changed and evolved.
For sure. Another piece which I resonated so clearly with me was the piece on Nashville women, the bro rule in country. I mean, coming up as an FM broadcaster, this was spot on. And this was a conversation I'm glad has been started. And there's, oh my God, there's so much work to do. And can you explain the bro rule?
So there is a piece of air quotes conventional wisdom, particularly within country FM broadcasting, that you can't play women back to back, and you can't play more than one woman an hour. And so obviously that has really fairly devastating effects in terms of, who has just basically who it seems like matters in country world, right? And whose careers get supported. The huge number of women who are not basically offered a rung up in their career, and also how that sort of distorts the idea of even who country is for, who's the listenership. And, when I interviewed some of these people who are very old guard and steeped in that reasoning and in this really outdated sexist worldview, these programmers really see things like, Me Too, or women who are country superstars, that everyone really has to kind of stay in their lane. They're very invested in the world not catching up to this, sort of insular, bro-run world with their firmly entrenched rules. And it's really changed how country has been as an industry, but also how country radio sounds since the 1990s, when you really did have at the dawn and middle of the 90s, huge country pop superstar crossover, led in part by, the success of Shania Twain. So, it's really been downhill to the point where in recent years, they've talked about how it's getting under 10% in terms of the representation of women on country radio and women artists. And so all of that's to say, I went to Nashville a few years ago. Very young women, some of them were 18 and 19, who were just saying, if this is how it is, and we know this going in, we're going to try to create something else. And we're also going to, fight like hell to really create a community that supports each other, because we don't have support otherwise. And so I got to spend a few days with these incredibly talented women and see what they were doing for themselves.
It's country radio in general, absolutely guilty. You're right. You realize that is not specific to that format. I mean, I remember you mentioned Bjork in the 1990s working for Q101 in Chicago. Female vocals were sound coded in the system so that they never orbited around each other. It was like a 30-minute separation of female voices.
Gosh.
So Bjork and Garbage would be on opposite ends of the hour, so as not to have too many women voices on the air. That was for an alternative station.
And there's a piece that isn't in here that is a piece that I did most recently it was an oral history of Lilith Fair. And, I had Sarah McLachlan and, the women who were absolutely the leading lights of that festival saying, I couldn't get signed. Amy Mann told me how she couldn't get signed because the label told her, well, we already have Sheryl Crow. I know, I know, right?
This is Amy Mann. This
is one of our great contemporary songwriters and just a huge icon in her own right, and they're just going, well, we already have a woman, or, that, when Sarah McLachlan was, truly peak of her career, going around, making the stops at the top 40 radio stations and, shaking the programmers' hands and all this, people would say sort of apologetically going, well, sorry, we're not going to put your song in rotation because we already have the new Lisa Loeb single. And it's just, and you're just like, all of that goes to make a lot of sense out of the massive, massive cultural impact and success of Lilith Fair, because there was an audience that was starving for those artists, that was desperate for that connection, and also desperate for a place where their fandom would be respected, And so there's all of these things are, fairly interconnected, even though they may be very different genres. And this idea of there can only be one woman pits, has historically pit so many women against each other needlessly, and so I really, there's things like that I wish were more further evolved in, stories that I, for example, the piece about R. Kelly that is in the book, where I talked to Jim DeRogatis and how long that's taken to unfold, and in some ways how pitiful the eventual justice there has been. So, this is as you can see, all of these things sort of create the touchstones of my interest in music journalism and the sort of path that most interested me.
Let's talk about the R. Kelly DeRogatis piece in the book. That started as a Twitter discussion between you and Jim?
Discussion. But Jim and I was sometimes fairly regularly fight a little bit on Twitter. And so, it started like that, and then it grew into DMs, and then it was phone conversation. And at the time, he really felt like people were no longer interested in hearing him sort of bang the drum of that beat that had been his and his alone for, almost 2 decades at that point. A long time. And people would mock him, that he was like, why don't you give it a rest? And you're persecuting R. Kelly. And he was desperate to, maybe not desperate, but he really thought that this story stood a better chance if it had a different messenger. And he thought I would be the good messenger. And he said, take this over. I will give you all my files and all this. And I was like, why don't we just have a conversation about this and see where it goes? Because I didn't know if I was, sorry, you can hear my dog Bowie.
That's the beauty of doing this from home.
I know, valiantly defending me from, being murdered by the UPS person as they deliver our packages, right? What would I do if I didn't have him to keep me alive through the day? But so I was talking to Jim about this, and we had this conversation. And at the time, no one was super interested in printing it. And my editor at the Village Voice was like, yeah, I'll do this. There's a new R. Kelly record coming. It'd be good to bring this back up. And no one had any idea that would be, a day later, would be the first time in like 9 years, 14 years, like a long time, that anyone had directly asked R. Kelly about it. And he was appearing on like an Atlanta radio station, and they brought it up like point blank. And that started a whole new process again, and a whole world of reporting for Jim opened up again about what we now know is R. Kelly, basically a much longer history of predation than people could have imagined.
Let's talk a little bit about journalism. Journalism's
do we have to?
We do, because that's what you do, and you're very good at it. Journalism is in a really interesting spot. It's been attacked relentlessly by the right for the past several years. The internet has kind of made it the Wild West. All that said, as I look at journalism from afar, it seems like there's great opportunity for really good writers, for people who want to dig in and get to a story, to write long form content, multimedia content. It seems like there's a world of cool shit that a journalist can do right now.
I think, this is very much where I'm at too. In the last couple of years, I've largely started working as a producer, working on music history podcasts, producing documentary work, editing books, in part because while there are a lot of different opportunities to just do different things in terms of media and the different ways to tell a story, it's really relegated to platforms that have a lot of control and a lot of say, and not a lot of them don't necessarily have a lane for music history or criticism. They're just not what people are investing in typically, but also, the alt weeklies I had in the course of putting this book together, I think 3-4 alt weeklies where I had been a regular contributor went away. They went out of business. They stopped publication. And that, it's sad and a bitter situation. And having worked in, I was one of the executive editors at MTV News in its final iteration a few years ago, and we lasted 17 months. And then, in one day, 53 people were laid off. And so it does really dash your hopes. I grew up in my parents' newsrooms. And so I've seen, this is a very long, slow wave of journalism being devalued. And part of the reason that I've turned to these other modes of journalism and particularly of storytelling is because even with all the long form and whatnot that we can do online, sometimes there's stories that are just better suited to audio or video. And, with books, to me, it's very important to do what I can to help ensure that there is documentation of artists and scenes, lots of times while they're still here, or to help try to change the ideas of whose stories are valuable. And continually open up, the canon and the idea of, just sort of expand our ideas about music and music history and culture as you can dive further into them in a way that you just can't in a 4,000 or 5,000 word article. And so these things that are longer forms are really particularly interesting for me. And also, I've been working as a critic since I was 16 years old, and I'm 44 now. And so I took up a lot of space in my industry in different ways for a long time. And I really wanted to help avail new and different opportunities to writers that were coming up in my wake. And I also just wanted to do different things myself so that I could expand my palette, expand what I can do and the stories I can tell and the things I can bring to an audience.
Well, and you put your mission statement in the book. The book is to be used as a tool, perhaps to prop or pry a door open wider for young writers and fans to use to interrogate or reject all that came before them. The book basically says everyone should be welcome at the Rock Critic table, women most obviously, but anyone with a story, have at it.
Yeah. And part of that too is that I don't, I also, have a great eagerness to encounter people who even, young critics who are like, I reject this idea that you've put out here, but I can, like that can even use the book to as a thing to figure out how they think or feel about music in opposition to how I think. I mean, not I don't want to necessarily see like it will be like sexist criticism and I reject just opera or whatever, but that I really am just deeply, deeply hopeful that it can be useful in the same way that so many, formative music critical texts were for me, like Rock She Wrote or Sex Revolts, or later on Mystery Train, or of course, Lester Bang's seminal tome. There's so many different things that influenced my thinking and my development as a writer. And I hope my book is half as useful to people as those many books were for me.
I perceive music journalism. I love music. I find music journalism something that is very difficult to do well. I think in addition to finding your voice and figuring out who you are in this universe, basic things like describing and contextualizing sound, I think is very difficult. Like I can't do it. I can never do it. But I think it looks easy on the page, on the screen. That person's just talking about music. I think it's incredibly hard. So I give you full credit. And
thank you. I wish it was easier myself. So, I'm just barely starting to get my brain back on after 15 months of having my children home. I'm being like talking to adults rather than talking to grade school age children about the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It's coming back to the world of this book and being able to think about music now that my kids are at camp. So is a real gift. I mean, this is something that really grew out of my fandom, my teenage fanzine that I started in high school, and writing for, local music publications and alt weeklies in Minneapolis when I was in high school. And later, more sort of community-based fanzines like Punk Planet. For me, I always loved writing, even when I was especially terrible at it. And then as a younger person, and then, secondly, for me, this has always really been an expression of fandom, but also a way to be in dialogue with the scenes that I'm part of, other feminists, bands and artists, and just trying to help push that dialogue along, or challenge it, or help get it started.
For people who are watching or listening from Chicago, Chicago's right there, front and center. It's the first part of the book. Essays and pieces based around Chicago artists. You talk about moving here when you're 21, Chance, Juicebox. There's the aforementioned conversation with Jim DeRogatis about R. Kelly. Tell me about your relationship with the Chicago music scene, being part of this landscape.
I mean, I don't know if I could have had the same career anywhere else. I had really cheap rent here, so it was possible for me to be a baby freelancer and not starve to death, just barely, but I managed. And when I first came here, I was so excited to be in, I was living kind of around Wicker Park, 7. Oh my gosh. And
for context, that was ground zero.
I mean, that was in a lot of ways, but there were so many ground zeros in Chicago, and that's kind of the point. at that point, being able to see, you know, just legendary shows, but also that in a night I could go. I had the first night that I lived, or first year that I lived here, maybe the year after. I remember in one night going to see like a hardcore matinee. I want to say that Don Caballero headlined at the Fireside Bowl. And then I went downtown and saw at the Chicago Theater Lauryn Hill with Outkast opening, which was like, I mean, best show I've ever seen for sure. And then from there, going to Lounge Acts and seeing Rex and June of 44.
I mean, come on.
So that was a really formative education, but crucially here, there's historically a phenomenal independent spirit and a sense of can do. And while sometimes I think there's, at the time when I got here, there was a very intact, very functional community that was pretty non-hierarchical, where people would really share ideas and support very generously. And it wasn't competitive. It was artistically competitive. But that there was a noise scene, and there was kind of the thrill jockey scene, and there was, kind of this more like old guard touch and go world, but there was also all of these young punk and hardcore bands and just things that were super, super left field. And one of the things I loved about Chicago was that, most of the folks I knew here, similar to me, had really omnivorous tastes. We would go see, the Tentet downtown, and then come back up and see something at the Empty Bottle that was just about as far as you can get from jazz. And, and also just as a DJ and, different bands that I was in, it's just a great music city historically. And the longer I've been here, the more I've come to understand the roots of that. And it's just really a gift, because a lot of other cities, you might have sort of enough infrastructure in a way to, or there's certain kinds of infrastructure, particularly when you're on the coasts, and people, and there's labels, and there's major media attention, and there's, you can tap into this, that, and the other thing that are more opportunities are typically aligned with, like, making it a big success or something. And here, in Chicago, if you want something to happen, you need to contribute to it. And then secondarily, you probably have to build it. There's not a lot of rungs here, there's, and that's why we have, I think, such a diverse and fascinating hip hop scene here right now, that, that's how you can get a No Name and a Chance and a Jamila and so many folks that are just doing really interesting work.
Really well said. All right, Jessica Hopper, here it is. Out Tuesday, the first collection of criticism by a living female rock critic. It is revised. It is expanded. It's awesome. It's from a
Thank you.
Sociological perspective, from a music perspective, from a local perspective. I really enjoyed reading this. And like I said, I hadn't read all the pieces when they were first out in the universe. So having them compiled here, absolutely love reading it.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you.